the last emperor of a dynasty that once controlled roughly a quarter of the entire world's economy, died in a small wooden hut in Burma, without even a scrap of land to call his own grave. How does an empire that built the Taj Mahal, that commanded armies numbering in the millions, collapse into the hands of a small foreign trading company? And what if the true cause of this collapse was never a foreign enemy at all, but the family's own habit of murdering each other for the throne, combined with the crushing expense of building monuments to the dead? What happened to the Mughal dynasty is one of history's most brutal and heartbreaking case studies in the fall of a world superpower. This is the true documented story of conquest, betrayal, obsessive construction, and quiet dispossession that brought down the Mughal Empire and left its final emperor with nothing but a piece of burnt charcoal to write his grief. The scale of what was ultimately lost is difficult to fully grasp using ordinary historical comparisons. Economic historians estimate that at its peak under Aurangzeb, the Mughal Empire generated somewhere between a quarter and a third of the entire world's total economic output, a concentration of wealth and productive capacity that has few parallels anywhere in recorded history, arguably exceeding even the combined economic weight of every European power at that specific moment. This was not a fragile backward state overwhelmed by superior foreign technology. It was, by any reasonable economic measure, one of the most sophisticated and prosperous political entities the world had ever produced. Understanding exactly how such staggering wealth and power eroded into complete dissolution within roughly a century and a half requires looking past any single military defeat into a much longer story of family violence, religious reversal, and financial exhaustion that the empire inflicted almost entirely upon itself. What makes the Mughal collapse particularly instructive for modern audiences studying the rise and fall of great powers is the sheer diversity of internal factors that compounded one another across successive generations. Unlike empires that fell primarily to a single dramatic conquest or a single catastrophic military defeat, the Mughal dynasty experienced a much slower, more layered unraveling, beginning with recurring succession violence that wasted resources and talent at nearly every generational transition, compounded by increasingly expensive religious and architectural projects that strained an otherwise genuinely sophisticated fiscal system, further worsened by a costly reversal of the religious tolerance policies that had once secured broad popular loyalty, and finally sealed by decades of grinding, inconclusive warfare against regional resistance movements that the imperial treasury simply could not sustain indefinitely. Each of these factors alone might have been survivable. Together, they created a cumulative burden that even one of history's wealthiest and most sophisticated states ultimately could not bear. Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, descended directly from two of history's most feared conquerors, Genghis Khan through his mother's line, and Timur, also known as Tamerlane, through his father's, a genetic and cultural inheritance of restless ambition that would define his entire life. He inherited a small kingdom in the Fergana Valley, in what is now Central Asia, at the astonishingly young age of 11, only to lose it almost immediately amid the ruthless family infighting that plagued Central Asian succession politics of this era. For years, Babur pursued an obsessive dream of recapturing Samarkand, the legendary city his ancestor Timur had once ruled, launching repeated military campaigns to seize it. Each attempt ended in failure, forcing him into a wandering, precarious existence as a landless prince with a small band of loyal followers. Having exhausted every realistic hope of reclaiming his Central Asian ambitions, Babur redirected his considerable military talent southward, setting his sights on the wealthy and comparatively vulnerable Indian subcontinent. In 1504, he captured Kabul, in what is now Afghanistan, establishing it as a secure operational base from which he could plan and eventually launch his campaign into India itself. the campaign that would ultimately make him remembered by history rather than forgotten as just another failed Central Asian warlord. Babur's own memoirs, the Baburnama, remain one of the most remarkable autobiographical documents to survive from the medieval world. Written in the Chagatai Turkic language, with a level of personal candor rarely found in royal chronicles of the period. He wrote openly about his failures, his homesickness for the gardens and melons of Central Asia, and his genuine ambivalence about the hot, unfamiliar climate of India, even as he prepared to conquer it. This personal, often melancholic quality distinguishes Babur from many of history's other great conquerors, who typically left behind only official court chronicles designed to flatter rather than genuinely reveal their inner thoughts. His memoir provides historians with an unusually intimate window into the psychology of a man who spent decades as a wandering, dispossessed prince before finally achieving, almost by circumstance rather than original design, the founding of one of history's great empires. Babur's own assessment of India, recorded candidly in his memoirs shortly after his conquest, reveals a conqueror who remained genuinely conflicted about the land he had just spent years fighting to control. He complained at length about India's heat, its lack of the fruits and gardens he had loved in Central Asia, and what he considered the unsophisticated manners of the local population, even as he simultaneously marveled at the country's tremendous wealth, its skilled craftsmen, and the sheer scale of the territory now under his command. This ambivalence, conquering a land he did not particularly like on a purely personal level, yet recognizing its strategic and economic value beyond anything available to him in Central Asia, captures something genuinely poignant about a ruler whose life had been defined by displacement and loss long before he ever achieved the lasting success that history would eventually credit him with. A disaffected regional governor in India, who despised his own ruler, Sultan Ibrahim Lodi, secretly invited Babur to invade Delhi, internal betrayal opening the door that external conquest alone might never have managed to force. The numerical disparity between the two forces was almost absurd. Babur commanded a mere 12,000 soldiers, while the Lodi Sultanate fielded over 100,000 troops, backed by 1,000 war elephants. What decided the battle was technology India had never encountered in combat before. Babur brought Ottoman-derived gunpowder weaponry, including cannon and matchlock firearms, giving him a decisive tactical edge that raw troop numbers alone could not overcome. He employed a specific defensive tactic borrowed from Ottoman military practice, lashing together 700 ox carts into a protective barrier specifically designed to blunt and disrupt the terrifying momentum of enemy war elephant charges. The thunderous, unfamiliar sound of cannon fire threw the Lodi Sultanate's own war elephants into total panic, sending the massive animals stampeding backward directly through their own ranks and killing tens of thousands of Lodi's own soldiers in the resulting chaos. Ibrahim Lodi died on the battlefield, and Babur marched triumphantly into Delhi, formally establishing the Mughal Empire in 1526, a dynasty born from a battle his own tiny army should never have realistically won. The specific gunpowder technology Babur deployed at Panipat deserves closer examination, since it represents one of the earliest and most consequential introductions of Ottoman-style firearms warfare into the Indian subcontinent. His artillery corps was commanded by Ustad Ali Kuli, a specialist trained in Ottoman gunnery techniques, whose cannon were positioned behind the improvised cart barrier in a configuration that allowed sustained fire against the advancing Lodi forces, while Mughal cavalry protected the flanks. This combination of static defensive firepower with mobile cavalry striking power represented a genuinely innovative tactical synthesis for the Indian battlefield of this period, one that Indian military commanders had simply never encountered in combat before and had no established tactical doctrine for countering effectively. The psychological impact of gunpowder weapons, entirely apart from their purely physical destructive capacity, proved just as decisive as the material damage they inflicted, since neither the Lodi soldiers nor their war elephants had any prior experience with the deafening noise and smoke that accompanied Mughal artillery fire. The First Battle of Panipat's broader significance extends well beyond its immediate military outcome, since it established a specific site that would prove strategically decisive in Indian military history repeatedly across subsequent centuries. The flat, open plains near Panipat, located roughly 90 kilometers north of Delhi, offered exactly the kind of terrain that favored large-scale cavalry and artillery engagements, meaning that whoever controlled Delhi needed to be able to defend this specific approach corridor against invasion from the northwest. The Second Battle of Panipat, fought decades later to secure young Akbar's throne, and the later Third Battle of Panipat between Maratha and Afghan forces in 1761, both occurred at essentially the same strategic location, reflecting the enduring geographic logic that made this particular stretch of plain the recurring decisive battleground for control of northern India across more than 2 centuries of South Asian military history. Babur died in 1530, and his son Humayun inherited the throne, but he lacked his father's sharp strategic instincts and decisive battlefield judgment at the exact moment the fragile young empire needed both most urgently. An ambitious Afghan warlord named Sher Shah Suri organized a rebellion and decisively defeated Humayun, driving him from the throne entirely in 1540, barely a decade after the empire's founding. Humayun spent the following 15 years as a genuine refugee, wandering in hunger and desperation before eventually securing asylum at the Safavid court in Persia. With crucial military support provided by the Persian Shah, Humayun finally managed to reclaim Delhi and restore Mughal rule in 1555, a remarkable second act after so many years of humiliating exile. In a bitterly ironic final twist, Humayun ruled for only a few months after this hard-won restoration, before dying from injuries sustained in an almost absurdly mundane accident, tripping and falling down a library staircase. Humayun's 15 years in exile were far more than simply a personal ordeal. They fundamentally reshaped Mughal culture in ways that would define the dynasty for generations. His extended stay at the sophisticated Safavid Persian court exposed him to Persian artistic, architectural, and literary traditions that he brought back to India upon his restoration, along with a number of skilled Persian artists and craftsmen who accompanied him. This Persian cultural influence, absorbed during the darkest and most humiliating period of Humayun's life, would eventually flower into the distinctive Indo-Persian artistic synthesis that defined Mughal painting, architecture, and court culture at its later peak, meaning that the empire's greatest cultural achievements, in a very real sense, were seeded during its founder's son's most desperate years as a penniless refugee begging for shelter in a foreign court. Sher Shah Suri, the Afghan warlord who defeated Humayun and briefly ruled northern India during the Mughal interregnum, deserves recognition in his own right as a genuinely capable administrator whose brief reign left a lasting mark on Indian governance, independent of the larger Mughal narrative. He reformed the currency system, introducing the silver rupee that would remain the standard currency of the subcontinent for centuries afterward, and constructed the Grand Trunk Road, a major highway connecting Bengal to the Indus region that facilitated trade and troop movement across the breadth of northern India. His premature death from a gunpowder explosion during a siege in 1545, only 5 years after seizing power, created a succession crisis of his own that ultimately allowed Humayun the opening he needed to return from exile and reclaim the throne his family had lost. Akbar ascended to the throne at just 13 years old, initially governing under the careful guardianship and military protection of the capable General Bairam Khan. Bairam Khan led Mughal forces to a decisive victory at the Second Battle of Panipat in 1556, crushing the powerful Hindu general Hemu and securing the young emperor's fragile hold on the throne. By the age of 18, Akbar had grown confident and capable enough to remove Bairam Khan from power entirely, taking full and direct personal command of the empire's affairs for the very first time. He subsequently built an extraordinarily effective and rapid cavalry force, using it to dramatically expand Mughal territory across both northern and central India in a series of decisive military campaigns. Rather than simply crushing the proud Hindu Rajput kingdoms through pure military conquest, Akbar pursued a shrewder political strategy, marrying Rajput princesses to forge lasting political alliances that would prove far more durable and cost-effective than continuous warfare. Akbar's relationship with the Rajput kingdoms deserves particular examination as one of the most sophisticated pieces of medieval statecraft anywhere in world history. Rather than treating conquered Rajput rulers as humiliated vassals, he actively incorporated them into the highest levels of Mughal administration and military command, with Rajput generals leading Mughal armies and Rajput nobles serving as trusted provincial governors across the empire. His marriage to the Rajput princess Harka Bai, who became the mother of his eventual successor Jahangir, exemplified this integration policy at the very heart of the dynasty itself. This approach created a genuinely multicultural imperial elite that combined Central Asian Muslim military tradition with indigenous Hindu political and administrative expertise, a synthesis that gave the empire administrative depth and legitimacy among its overwhelmingly Hindu population that pure military occupation could never have achieved on its own. Not every Rajput kingdom accepted Mughal overlordship peacefully, and Akbar's campaign against Mewar, whose proud ruling Sisodia clan refused to submit even after prolonged siege and negotiation, illustrates the limits of his generally conciliatory approach. The 1568 siege of Chittorgarh, Mewar's mountain fortress capital, ended with Akbar's forces breaching the walls after a prolonged and costly siege, followed by a massacre of the fortress's defenders and the mass self-immolation, known as Jauhar, of the fortress's women rather than face capture, a brutal episode that Akbar's own court chroniclers recorded without particular embarrassment, reflecting the genuine limits of even his relatively pragmatic and accommodating approach to conquered peoples when faced with sustained, determined resistance. The Mewar kingdom's continued resistance under its later ruler Maharana Pratap, who refused even after Chittorgarh's fall to formally submit to Mughal authority, has become one of the most celebrated episodes in later Indian nationalist historiography, frequently invoked as an example of principled resistance against imperial domination. The Battle of Haldighati in 1576, in which Maharana Pratap's smaller Rajput force fought Akbar's much larger Mughal army to a costly but inconclusive standstill, is still commemorated in Rajasthan today as a symbol of defiant regional independence, illustrating how even Akbar's generally successful integration policy could not entirely eliminate every source of local resistance to centralized Mughal authority across the vast and diverse territories the empire ultimately came to control. Akbar established the Mansabdari administrative system, ranking both military and civil officials according to demonstrated merit and competence, rather than simply hereditary bloodline or aristocratic birth. He abolished the jizya tax, the discriminatory levy that had specifically required non-Muslim subjects to pay additional taxation solely because of their religion, earning him the genuine, widespread support and gratitude of millions of Hindu subjects across the empire. Akbar constructed the Ibadat Khana, a dedicated hall of religious debate, deliberately inviting scholars representing Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, and other faiths to engage in open, structured theological discussion in his presence. He attempted to establish an entirely new syncretic faith, Din-e-Ilahi, which deliberately combined elements drawn from multiple religious traditions in an ambitious effort to unify his religiously diverse empire under a single shared spiritual framework, though the new faith largely failed to gain any lasting traction after his eventual death. Under Akbar's sustained and capable leadership, the Mughal Empire's total economic output came to significantly exceed that of contemporary England by many multiples, establishing Mughal India as unquestionably one of the wealthiest and most economically sophisticated political entities anywhere on the planet. The Mansabdari system's underlying logic deserves closer examination, since it represents one of the more genuinely innovative administrative solutions to a problem that plagued nearly every large pre-modern empire: how to maintain a large, effective bureaucracy and military without allowing office holders to establish independent, hereditary power bases that might eventually threaten central authority. Under this system, officials held ranks denominated in specific numbers, indicating both their salary grade and the number of cavalry troops they were obligated to maintain for imperial service. But these ranks were explicitly non-hereditary, requiring each successive generation to earn their position anew through demonstrated service and loyalty. This meant that even the most powerful Mansabdars could not simply pass their status and resources to their children automatically, a structural feature that helped prevent the kind of entrenched regional aristocracy that had undermined centralized authority in many other pre-modern empires. Though, as later Mughal history would demonstrate, this system also depended heavily on a strong, engaged emperor capable of personally overseeing and enforcing its merit-based principles. Akbar's revenue administration, developed primarily under his brilliant finance minister Raja Todar Mal, represented an equally significant achievement independent of the more famous Mansabdari military system. Todar Mal implemented a systematic land survey and revenue assessment across the empire, calculating expected agricultural yields for different soil types and crop varieties, then establishing tax rates calibrated to actual productive capacity rather than arbitrary demands that might exceed what any given region could realistically sustain. This system, refined over years of careful measurement and adjustment, provided the Mughal state with remarkably reliable and predictable revenue streams, forming the essential financial foundation that made possible everything from military campaigns to the monumental architectural projects that later emperors would undertake. A foundation whose careful fiscal discipline would prove increasingly difficult for Akbar's less financially disciplined successors to maintain. The specific measurement techniques Todar Mal's survey teams employed, including standardized land measurement units and careful record-keeping of crop rotation patterns across different regions, represented a level of bureaucratic sophistication that impressed European observers who encountered Mughal administrative practice during this period. Dutch and English merchants trading in Mughal territory during Akbar's reign and immediately afterward frequently commented in their own commercial correspondence and travel accounts on the remarkable order and predictability of Mughal tax administration compared to the more arbitrary and often corrupt revenue systems they had encountered elsewhere in Asia, a testament to just how genuinely advanced Mughal administrative capacity had become at the height of Akbar's reign, before later generations gradually allowed this careful system to erode under the pressure of expensive wars and extravagant royal spending. Akbar's son Jahangir inherited the throne and generally succeeded in maintaining the empire's existing stability, though he carried one significant and increasingly consequential personal weakness. Jahangir developed a severe and progressively worsening addiction to both alcohol and opium, an affliction that steadily degraded his personal capacity for effective, engaged governance as his reign continued. His wife, Empress Nur Jahan, proved to be one of the most intelligent, capable, and genuinely influential women in the entire history of the Mughal dynasty. As Jahangir's addiction increasingly incapacitated him, Nur Jahan effectively assumed direct control over state affairs, going so far as to have official government seals and minted coinage bear her own name and image. Despite these ongoing internal political complications at the very top of the imperial hierarchy, this specific era is remembered by art historians as a genuine golden age for Mughal painting and the broader decorative arts, flourishing even amid the emperor's personal struggles. Nur Jahan's political career deserves recognition as one of the most remarkable achievements by any woman in pre-modern imperial history anywhere in the world. Beyond simply managing state affairs during her husband's incapacitation, she personally organized and led hunting expeditions, was renowned for her skill with firearms, and built an extensive network of political patronage that included prominent positions for her own family members within the imperial administration. Her father, Itimadud-Dowla, served as chief minister, and her brother Asaf Khan became one of the empire's most powerful nobles, creating what amounted to a genuine ruling family faction operating alongside, and in practice often ahead of, the nominal emperor himself. The tomb she commissioned for her father in Agra, sometimes called the Baby Taj for its architectural similarity to the later, more famous monument, is now recognized by architectural historians as a direct precursor and inspiration for the Taj Mahal that her own stepson Shah Jahan would later build for his own wife. The eventual succession struggle following Jahangir's death revealed the practical limits of Nur Jahan's accumulated power, despite decades of effective control over state affairs. She had favoured her own son-in-law Shahryar as heir over Shah Jahan, her stepson through Jahangir's other wife, setting up a final succession contest in which her extensive political network ultimately proved insufficient against Shah Jahan's superior military support and more experienced generalship. Following Shah Jahan's victory, Nur Jahan was effectively retired from political life, living out her remaining years in comfortable but politically irrelevant retirement. A reminder that even the most successful exercise of informal power behind the throne remained, in the final analysis, dependent on the ongoing goodwill and continued survival of whichever emperor happened to sit upon it. Shah Jahan ascended to the throne in 1628 through a characteristically brutal path, ordering the execution of his own brothers and eligible male relatives, specifically to eliminate every possible rival claimant to the succession before they could organize any meaningful challenge. He subsequently guided the empire to its absolute peak of architectural grandeur and lavish material display, commissioning building projects and treasury exhibitions on a scale that dwarfed even his considerable predecessor's own achievements. The legendary peacock throne took 7 full years to construct, encrusted with gold, emeralds, rubies, and the famous Koh-i-Noor diamond, a single royal seat whose staggering value alone reportedly exceeded the entire construction cost of the Taj Mahal. Shah Jahan also constructed an entirely new capital city, Shah Jahanabad, known today as Old Delhi, along with the massive and imposing Red Fort complex that still stands prominently at its historic centre. The specific violence surrounding Shah Jahan's own accession deserves examination as a pattern that would recur, with increasingly destructive consequences throughout later Mughal history. Unlike his grandfather Akbar, who had successfully passed power to Jahangir through a relatively orderly succession, or even Jahangir's own contested but ultimately peaceful transition, Shah Jahan's path to the throne involved the systematic execution of virtually every male relative who might conceivably challenge his claim, including cousins, nephews, and brothers who had shown no particular indication of rebellion themselves. This escalating pattern of fratricidal violence at each successive generational transition reflected the fundamental structural weakness embedded in Mughal succession practice from its very beginning. Unlike many other monarchies that had developed clear rules of primogeniture, Mughal succession remained, in practice, determined by whichever son could most effectively eliminate his rivals through military force and political maneuvering, a system that guaranteed periodic civil war at nearly every transition of imperial power. Shah Jahan's beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal, died during the delivery of their 14th child, and his grief was reportedly so overwhelming and profound that his hair turned completely white virtually overnight. He assembled the finest available architects and craftsmen from across the Islamic world, Persia, and even Europe, to design and construct what would become the single largest and most elaborate mausoleum project the world had yet seen. The construction of the Taj Mahal ultimately required more than 20,000 labourers and roughly 1,000 elephants, taking 22 years to complete between 1632 and 1653. This staggering expenditure on precious marble and jewels for the project placed severe and increasingly unsustainable strain on the imperial treasury, contributing significantly to the broader financial pressures the empire would face in subsequent decades. The popular legend claiming Shah Jahan ordered the hands of his own architects amputated specifically to prevent them from ever designing anything more beautiful is, historians confirm, entirely unsupported by any genuine contemporary historical record. The Taj Mahal's actual architectural and engineering achievement deserves recognition independent of the romantic mythology that has grown up around it over subsequent centuries. The white marble used in construction was quarried at Makrana in Rajasthan, transported hundreds of kilometers to Agra using specially reinforced wagons, pulled by teams of oxen and elephants. The precious and semi-precious stones inlaid throughout the structure, including jasper, jade, turquoise, sapphire, and carnelian, were sourced from locations as distant as Afghanistan, Tibet, Sri Lanka, and Arabia, representing a genuinely global network of material procurement for a single construction project. The building's remarkable symmetry, its precisely calculated proportions, and its optical illusions, including minarets that lean slightly outward to appear perfectly vertical when viewed from the central approach, protecting the main tomb structure in the event of an earthquake, causing them to collapse away from rather than onto the mausoleum, reveal a level of architectural and structural sophistication that modern engineers continue to study and admire nearly 4 centuries after its completion. The chief architect generally credited with the Taj Mahal's design, Ustad Ahmad Lahari, worked within a broader design and construction team that included specialists recruited from across the Islamic world, reflecting the truly cosmopolitan nature of Mughal artistic and technical patronage at its peak. Calligraphers inscribed Quranic verses across the monument's surfaces, using a technique of inlaid black marble against the white background, with the lettering deliberately increasing in size as it rises higher on the structure, creating an optical illusion that makes the text appear uniform in size when viewed from ground level far below. A subtle but genuinely sophisticated understanding of perspective and viewing angle that speaks to the extraordinary attention to detail invested in every aspect of the monument's design and execution. The Taj Mahal complex extends well beyond the famous central mausoleum itself, encompassing an extensive formal garden laid out according to the Persian charbagh design, divided into 4 quadrants by water channels, symbolizing the 4 rivers of paradise described in Islamic tradition, along with a mosque and a guest house flanking the main structure in careful architectural symmetry. This comprehensive design, integrating garden, water features, and architecture into a unified spiritual and aesthetic statement about paradise and eternal love, reflects broader Persian and Islamic garden traditions that Mughal rulers had been refining and adapting to Indian conditions since Babur's own reign, when he had first introduced formal Persian-style gardens to a subcontinent whose existing landscape architecture traditions differed considerably from what the Central Asian conquerors had been accustomed to in their original homeland. When Shah Jahan fell seriously ill in 1657, his 4 adult sons immediately erupted into open civil war against one another, each desperately seeking to seize the throne before the others could act. Although Shah Jahan personally favoured his eldest son, Dara Shikoh, as his intended successor, Aurangzeb, a considerably more capable and ruthless military commander, decisively defeated his elder brother's forces on the battlefield. Aurangzeb subsequently captured Dara Shikoh, ordered his execution, and had his brother's severed head delivered directly to their own father as a horrifying and deliberately cruel demonstration of his complete victory. Shah Jahan himself was forcibly deposed from power and imprisoned within Agra fort for the following 8 years, confined by his own victorious son. Shah Jahan spent the remaining years of his life gazing out at the Taj Mahal from his prison window, contemplating his beloved wife's tomb until the very day of his own death. Dara Shikoh, the brother Aurangzeb executed, represents one of history's more poignant counterfactual figures, a genuinely intellectual prince whose personal interests leaned toward religious syncretism and philosophical inquiry rather than military conquest or strict religious orthodoxy. He had personally translated Hindu Upanishads into Persian and authored works exploring common ground between Islamic Sufi mysticism and Hindu Vedantic philosophy, continuing in many respects the syncretic religious spirit that Akbar had championed generations earlier. Had Dara Shikoh won the succession war rather than Aurangzeb, many historians speculate that Mughal India might have continued along a path of religious tolerance and cultural integration, rather than the increasingly rigid orthodoxy that would characterize Aurangzeb's own subsequent policies, though such counterfactual speculation, however tempting, cannot account for the many other structural and economic pressures that were independently building against the empire's long-term stability, regardless of which brother had ultimately prevailed. The specific manner of Dara Shikoh's execution and the public display of his severed head to their father carries a symbolic weight that later Mughal chroniclers and modern historians alike have found genuinely difficult to fully process. Contemporary accounts describe Shah Jahan's profound grief upon receiving this gruesome delivery, compounding the psychological devastation of his simultaneous loss of both political power and his favoured son within the span of a single military campaign. This episode, perhaps more than any other single event in Mughal dynastic history, crystallizes the fundamentally brutal nature of imperial succession politics that had characterized the dynasty from its very founding, suggesting that whatever cultural and architectural glories the empire achieved, its internal political mechanisms remained locked in a pattern of violence that each successive generation seemed unable or unwilling to reform. Unlike Akbar before him, Aurangzeb abandoned the empire's long-standing policy of religious tolerance, destroying Hindu temples and reinstating the discriminatory jizya tax that his great-grandfather had specifically worked to eliminate. The Mughal Empire reached its absolute largest territorial extent in history under his rule, controlling nearly the entire Indian subcontinent. But this vast territory proved extraordinarily difficult to actually govern and administer effectively. He spent the final 27 years of his reign locked in a grinding, ultimately inconclusive military campaign against the Deccan region of southern India. Under the leadership of the brilliant Hindu military commander Shivaji, the Maratha Confederacy employed sustained guerrilla warfare tactics that bled Mughal resources dry and inflicted continuous, punishing damage on imperial forces. These endless, expensive military campaigns devastated the imperial treasury, leaving soldiers unpaid and farmers crushed under punishing taxation, fueling rebellions that erupted across virtually every corner of the weakening empire. Aurangzeb's reign, despite its ultimate contribution to imperial decline, presents historians with a genuinely complex figure who defies simple characterization as merely a religious fanatic or an incompetent ruler. He was, by most contemporary accounts, personally austere and disciplined, avoiding the lavish personal luxury that had characterized his father's reign, and he governed with a work ethic that impressed even his critics, reportedly handling government paperwork personally well into old age. His military campaigns in the Deccan, while ultimately unsuccessful in permanently subduing the Maratha resistance, did succeed in defeating and annexing the previously independent sultanates of Bijapur and Golconda, technically expanding Mughal territory to its absolute maximum historical extent, even as the cost of doing so fatally undermined the empire's long-term financial and administrative capacity. This combination of personal discipline and strategic overreach makes Aurangzeb a figure whose reign illustrates, with particular clarity, how individual competence and dedication cannot by themselves compensate for fundamentally unsustainable imperial policy. The Maratha resistance that so thoroughly exhausted Aurangzeb's later reign deserves recognition as one of the most successful sustained guerrilla campaigns in pre-modern military history. Shivaji's forces, operating from mountain strongholds across the rugged Deccan terrain, employed hit-and-run tactics specifically designed to avoid direct confrontation with the numerically superior and better-equipped Mughal armies, instead targeting supply lines, isolated garrisons, and tax collection convoys in a sustained campaign of attrition. This asymmetric warfare strategy proved remarkably effective precisely because it denied Aurangzeb's forces the kind of decisive set-piece battle that might have allowed superior Mughal numbers and equipment to prove genuinely decisive, instead grinding down imperial resources and morale through years of frustrating, inconclusive skirmishing across difficult terrain that favored the smaller, more mobile Maratha forces at every turn. Shivaji's own coronation as an independent Hindu king in 1674, deliberately performed according to ancient Vedic ritual traditions rather than any Mughal-derived ceremonial framework, represented a direct ideological challenge to Mughal claims of universal sovereignty over the Indian subcontinent. This calculated assertion of independent Hindu kingship, maintained and expanded by his successors even after his own death in 1680, provided a genuine alternative political and religious framework that increasingly attracted regional support across western and central India precisely at the moment when Aurangzeb's own religious policies were alienating substantial portions of his Hindu subject population. A combination of military resistance and ideological alternative that Mughal forces, however numerically superior, ultimately proved unable to permanently suppress despite decades of sustained, expensive military campaigning across the entire region. The British East India Company first arrived in India during Jahangir's reign, initially requesting nothing more than modest, peaceful trading privileges from the Mughal court. As Mughal central authority steadily weakened over subsequent decades, the company quietly but steadily built increasingly fortified trading posts at Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta, expanding its practical territorial footprint under the guise of ordinary commerce. Aurangzeb's death in 1707 removed the final strong hand capable of holding the sprawling empire together, marking the effective beginning of its long, accelerating unraveling. Within a single subsequent decade, multiple Mughal emperors were installed and then swiftly assassinated by powerful court nobles who had effectively become the empire's true kingmakers, reducing the imperial throne itself to a prize fought over by competing factions. Foreign powers, including both the British and the French, recognized this internal fragmentation as a genuine opportunity, beginning to actively arm and train regional Indian factions, specifically to expand their own growing political influence across the subcontinent. The East India Company's transformation from a modest commercial trading enterprise into an increasingly powerful political and military force deserves careful examination, since this evolution was neither rapid nor originally intentional in any coordinated, centrally planned sense. Company officials initially sought only the trading privileges and warehouse security that any merchant enterprise operating in a foreign land might reasonably request. The specific decision to maintain private armed forces, ostensibly for the modest purpose of protecting company property and personnel, gradually expanded in scope and capability as company officials on the ground recognized that the weakening Mughal state created opportunities for direct territorial and political intervention that could prove enormously more profitable than simple trade alone. This gradual, almost accidental drift from commerce toward conquest, driven as much by ambitious individual company officials acting on their own initiative as by any deliberate strategic plan from London, represents one of history's more unusual examples of a private commercial corporation eventually supplanting an ancient sovereign empire. The specific administrative and legal framework the company developed to justify and formalize its growing political authority also deserves attention, since it reveals the careful, incremental nature of this transformation. Rather than declaring outright conquest, which would have provoked immediate and potentially unified resistance from Indian rulers still nominally loyal to Mughal authority, the company instead sought and obtained formal grants of revenue collection rights, known as Diwani, from the weakened Mughal court itself, technically operating as a legally sanctioned tax-collecting agent of the emperor, even as its actual practical authority increasingly superseded any genuine imperial oversight or control. This legal fiction of continued Mughal sovereignty, maintained for decades even as the company's actual power grew to encompass vast territories and populations, allowed the company to expand its authority with a degree of legal and diplomatic cover that outright military conquest would have made considerably more difficult to sustain internationally. The specific 1765 grant of Diwani rights over Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, formally issued by the nominal Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II following the company's military victory at the Battle of Buxar, represents perhaps the single clearest legal document marking this transformation from commercial enterprise to territorial power. Shah Alam II himself, ruling in name only from a position of near total dependence on whichever regional power happened to control Delhi at any given moment, had little practical choice but to formalize an arrangement that simply recognized realities on the ground, granting legal legitimacy to a transfer of revenue authority that the company had already effectively achieved through military force. This single document, more than any battle or treaty, arguably marks the precise legal moment at which the East India Company transformed from a trading corporation into the practical governing authority over tens of millions of Indian subjects. Major Mughal provinces, including Bengal, Awadh, and Hyderabad, effectively became independent states in all but formal name, no longer meaningfully answering to any central authority in Delhi. The Persian warlord Nader Shah led his forces across the mountains and invaded India with remarkably little organized resistance from the weakened Mughal state. The once formidable Mughal army was catastrophically defeated within a matter of mere hours at the Battle of Karnal, a humiliating demonstration of just how far imperial military capability had genuinely deteriorated. Nader Shah's forces subsequently massacred more than 30,000 residents of Delhi in a single day of horrific violence and reprisal. Persian forces looted centuries of accumulated Mughal treasure, including the legendary Peacock Throne and the Koh-i-Noor diamond, carrying it all away on a caravan of thousands of camels. After this catastrophic sack, the Mughal emperor became nothing more than a figurehead, a king in name only, waiting passively for others to dictate his fate. The Nader Shah invasion's psychological impact on the broader Mughal political system extended far beyond the immediate material losses, however staggering those losses genuinely were. Contemporary observers, both Indian and European, recorded a fundamental shift in how regional Indian rulers and foreign trading companies alike perceived Mughal military capability following this catastrophe. A dynasty that had once commanded the fearful respect of the entire subcontinent through demonstrated, overwhelming military superiority had now been shown, in the most humiliating and public manner possible, to be incapable of defending even its own capital against a comparatively modest invading force. This psychological transformation, the shattering of the aura of Mughal invincibility that had underpinned imperial authority for over 2 centuries, arguably did as much lasting damage to the empire's practical governing capacity as the actual physical plunder of its treasury, since much of centralized imperial authority throughout history depends heavily on subordinate rulers' continued belief that resistance would be futile. Nader Shah himself, despite the sheer scale of destruction his invasion inflicted on Delhi, withdrew from India relatively quickly after securing his plunder, having no genuine interest in establishing permanent Persian rule over Indian territory that would have required an entirely different and more sustained military and administrative commitment. This specific pattern, a devastating raid rather than a permanent conquest, meant that the nominal Mughal emperor retained his throne even after this catastrophe, but as a ruler whose treasury had been emptied and whose military reputation had been permanently shattered, presiding over an empire that continued formally intact while practically hollowed out from within, awaiting whichever combination of internal rebellion or external ambition would eventually complete the process of dissolution that Nader Shah's invasion had so dramatically accelerated. The British East India Company's decisive 1757 victory at the Battle of Plassey secured control over Bengal and marked the beginning of direct company military and administrative rule across large portions of India. By the 19th century, the once mighty Mughal emperor had been reduced to a mere honoured pensioner, receiving a modest allowance from the British specifically to continue residing within the walls of the Red Fort. Bahadur Shah Zafar II ascended to this diminished, largely symbolic throne in 1837, ultimately becoming the last Mughal emperor in the dynasty's long history. He held little genuine interest in politics or governance, being instead a devoted Sufi mystic and a celebrated, genuinely gifted poet writing in the Urdu language, content to spend his days composing verse in his private gardens. Meanwhile, the increasingly powerful East India Company grew emboldened enough to threaten expelling the Mughal royal family from the Red Fort entirely, and abolishing the imperial title altogether following Zafar's eventual death. Even as ordinary Indians and the company's own native soldiers, the sepoys, quietly accumulated deep and growing resentment toward British land seizures and perceived religious interference. Bahadur Shah Zafar's poetic output deserves recognition as a genuinely significant contribution to Urdu literature, independent of his largely symbolic political role. His ghazals, a traditional Persian and Urdu poetic form typically exploring themes of love, loss, and spiritual longing, are still studied and recited by Urdu literature enthusiasts today, and several of his most famous compositions were later set to music and remain popular in South Asian musical traditions well into the contemporary era. Contemporary accounts describe him presiding over regular poetic gatherings, or mashairas, in his palace gardens, where poets would recite original verse and receive feedback from assembled peers and the emperor himself, continuing a rich tradition of Mughal courtly literary culture, even as the actual political substance of imperial authority had been reduced to almost nothing beyond the ceremonial trappings of the Red Fort itself. The broader social and economic tensions building toward the 1857 rebellion extended well beyond the specific grievance over greased rifle cartridges that ultimately provided the immediate spark. British land revenue policies had displaced numerous traditional landholders across northern India, creating widespread resentment among the dispossessed aristocracy. The company's annexation of the previously independent Kingdom of Awadh in 1856, carried out on the pretext of alleged misgovernment, was widely perceived across India as a particularly egregious example of British disregard for existing political arrangements and legitimate local authority. Religious and cultural anxieties about British missionary activity and perceived interference with traditional Hindu and Muslim social practices compounded these economic and political grievances, creating a genuinely combustible combination of resentments across multiple social classes and religious communities that the cartridge controversy ultimately ignited into open, widespread rebellion. The doctrine of lapse, a specific British colonial policy under Governor-General Lord Dalhousie, that allowed the company to annex any princely state whose ruler died without a natural biological heir, regardless of whether that ruler had a legally adopted son under traditional Hindu succession practices, generated particularly intense resentment among India's remaining princely states in the years immediately preceding the rebellion. Several prominent rebellion leaders, including the Rani of Jhansi, whose own kingdom had been annexed under this specific policy following her husband's death, had direct personal grievances against British colonial administration that predated and reinforced the broader religious and economic tensions building across the wider Indian population, illustrating how the rebellion drew together multiple distinct streams of accumulated grievance into a single, if ultimately uncoordinated, uprising against British authority. Rumours that new British-issued rifle cartridges were greased with both pig and cow fat, deeply offensive to Muslim and Hindu religious sensibilities respectively, ignited the sepoy soldiers' simmering rebellion into open, violent revolt. Rebelling soldiers stormed into the Red Fort and forcibly compelled the frail, elderly 82-year-old Zafar to accept nominal leadership of the uprising, a role he had never personally sought or genuinely wanted. British forces mobilized substantial reinforcements to besiege Delhi, subjecting the city to sustained and relentless artillery bombardment over the following weeks. Brutal close-quarters street-by-street fighting eventually allowed British forces to breach the city's defensive gates and force their way inside. Zafar and his remaining family fled the palace, seeking refuge at the tomb of the earlier Emperor Humayun, the very same historical site from which the Mughal dynasty had once staged its own remarkable comeback centuries before. In the brutal reprisals that followed the city's fall, British forces killed tens of thousands of Delhi's residents, including many children and elderly civilians, in a deliberate campaign of retributive violence. The scale and brutality of the British response to the 1857 rebellion, sometimes called the Indian Mutiny in older British historiography, and increasingly referred to as India's First War of Independence in Indian historical scholarship, reflected genuine panic among British officials about the potential complete loss of their entire Indian territorial holdings. Beyond the direct military reprisals in Delhi itself, the British response included mass executions across numerous other rebellion centres, the deliberate destruction of entire neighbourhoods and religious sites associated with the uprising, and a systematic dismantling of remaining Mughal court institutions and symbols throughout the wider region. This period also marked a significant hardening of British racial and religious attitudes toward their Indian subjects more broadly, with the rebellion frequently cited in subsequent decades as justification for increasingly discriminatory colonial policies and a general abandonment of the more accommodating approach toward Indian religious and cultural practices that had characterized earlier phases of British involvement in the subcontinent. The siege of Delhi itself, lasting several months through the intense heat of the Indian summer, took a severe toll on both besieging British forces and the defenders trapped within the city walls. British and allied Indian troops camped on the ridge overlooking Delhi suffered heavily from disease, heat exhaustion, and repeated sorties by rebel forces attempting to break the siege before reinforcements could arrive. When the final assault came in September 1857, the fighting inside the city proved exceptionally brutal, with British and Indian troops fighting street by street against determined rebel resistance, often engaging in close combat through narrow lanes and fortified buildings that had been converted into makeshift defensive positions throughout the old city. The rebellion's suppression across the broader region beyond Delhi itself extended over many additional months, with British forces conducting sustained campaigns against remaining centres of resistance in Lucknow, Kanpur, and other cities where rebel forces and allied Indian rulers continued organised opposition well into 1858. The eventual complete restoration of British control across northern India came at an enormous cost in human life on all sides, with historians estimating that combined military and civilian deaths from the rebellion and its suppression numbered well into the hundreds of thousands, making it one of the most devastating conflicts fought anywhere in the 19th century world, and one whose long-term political consequences, including the formal transfer of governing authority from the East India Company directly to the British Crown in 1858, permanently reshaped the entire structure of British colonial rule over the Indian subcontinent for the following 90 years. British officer William Hodson besieged Humayun's tomb directly and forced Zafar to formally surrender himself into British custody. In a deliberate and calculated act to permanently extinguish the Mughal bloodline, Hodson personally ordered Zafar's own sons and grandsons stripped of their royal garments and summarily shot dead on the spot, without any pretense of trial. Zafar himself was subsequently subjected to a humiliating formal trial for treason held within the very walls of his own former palace. At 84 years old, Zafar was loaded onto an ox cart and forcibly transported out of India entirely, exiled to confinement in a small wooden house in Rangoon, Burma. Denied access to conventional pen, ink, or paper by his British captors, the aged former emperor used burnt charcoal to compose mournful poetry directly onto the walls of his confinement, giving voice to his profound grief over everything his family and his nation had lost. He died quietly in obscurity in 1862, and the British buried him hastily in an unmarked grave, formally closing the book on 331 years of Mughal imperial history, bringing to a permanent end what had once been among the most magnificent empires the world had ever known. The physical and cultural traces of Mughal rule remain deeply woven into the fabric of the modern Indian subcontinent, in ways that extend far beyond the celebrated monuments most visitors associate with the dynasty. Urdu, the language in which Bahadur Shah Zafar composed his final mournful poetry, remains a major language spoken by well over 100 million people across India, Pakistan, and diaspora communities worldwide, carrying within its vocabulary and literary traditions the direct cultural inheritance of Mughal court culture. The administrative and legal terminology that continues to appear throughout Indian and Pakistani government institutions, the culinary traditions that blend Central Asian, Persian, and Indian influences into what much of the world now recognizes as classic South Asian cuisine, and the architectural vocabulary that continues to influence buildings throughout the region, all trace direct lineage back to the centuries of Mughal cultural synthesis. The specific fate of Bahadur Shah Zafar's grave itself provides a poignant coda to this larger story of dispossession and forgetting. For over a century, the exact location of his burial site in Rangoon remained largely unknown and unmarked, reflecting both British colonial indifference to preserving any dignity for the deposed dynasty and the broader currents of historical amnesia that swept over the more uncomfortable episodes of colonial conquest. It was only in 1991 that Burmese authorities, responding to renewed historical interest from India and Pakistan, definitively located and properly marked his grave, allowing the site to become a modest but meaningful place of pilgrimage and historical reflection for visitors from the subcontinent whose own national histories remain permanently entangled with the story of the empire he represented. Modern historians studying the Mughal collapse increasingly emphasize a pattern that resonates well beyond this specific empire's particular story: the specific danger of institutional structures that depend entirely on the personal competence of whoever currently holds power, without developing durable mechanisms for peaceful succession or sustained financial discipline that can survive the inevitable arrival of less capable or less fortunate rulers. Akbar's genuinely innovative administrative system, so effective under his own personally engaged leadership, ultimately proved unable to constrain the destructive family violence and unsustainable spending patterns of his less disciplined successors. The empire that built the Taj Mahal as a monument to eternal love ultimately could not build institutions robust enough to survive its own family's recurring pattern of fratricide and its rulers' recurring temptation toward monuments more expensive than the treasury could sustainably bear. The Red Fort in Delhi, once the beating heart of Mughal imperial authority, today serves as the site from which India's Prime Minister addresses the nation each Independence Day. A striking historical irony in which the very fortress from which British forces expelled the last Mughal emperor now hosts the annual celebration of the nation's independence from British rule itself. The Taj Mahal, meanwhile, receives millions of visitors annually, most of whom come to admire its architectural beauty, with only passing awareness of the complex, often brutal history of the dynasty that built it. A monument to love and grief that has, in the centuries since its construction, become something considerably larger and more universal than the specific imperial family whose fortunes it was originally intended to commemorate. What the Mughal story ultimately teaches, perhaps more clearly than almost any other imperial collapse in world history, is the specific danger of conflating personal or dynastic glory with genuine institutional resilience. An empire that commanded a quarter of the world's economic output, that fielded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and that produced some of the most celebrated architectural achievements in human history, nonetheless proved unable to survive roughly a century and a half of compounding internal family violence, religious reversal, and unsustainable spending, undone not primarily by any external enemy's superior strength, but by its own recurring failure to build succession and governance systems capable of surviving beyond any single capable ruler's own lifetime. The specific arc from Akbar's genuinely inclusive, administratively innovative reign to Aurangzeb's costly religious rigidity and endless warfare, and finally to Bahadur Shah Zafar's poetry-writing captivity, traces a trajectory that historians studying imperial decline across many different civilizations and eras find remarkably instructive. Each individual decision along this trajectory, Shah Jahan's determination to build an unprecedented monument to his grief, Aurangzeb's religious convictions driving decades of costly military campaigns, the East India Company's incremental, almost accidental accumulation of political authority, made a certain kind of sense from the perspective of the specific individuals making these choices at the time. Yet the cumulative effect of these individually rational decisions was the complete unraveling of what had briefly been one of the most powerful and prosperous empires the world had ever produced, a pattern of gradual, compounding institutional failure that offers sobering lessons for any large, complex political or economic system whose continued success depends on the consistent good judgment of whoever currently holds power, rather than on durable structures capable of correcting for individual human weakness and ambition across successive generations. Today, visitors from Norway, Switzerland, Germany, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia arrive by the millions each year to photograph the Taj Mahal's serene white marble against the morning light, largely unaware that the dynasty which built it ended with an 84-year-old poet king writing his final verses in charcoal on the walls of a foreign prison, his body eventually lowered into a grave so obscure that it took more than a century to properly locate. The gap between that gleaming monument to eternal love and the forgotten grave of the empire's final ruler captures, perhaps better than any single historical fact could, the full and complicated truth about how even the grandest human achievements can coexist with the most complete and quiet forms of historical erasure.